Hey guys, this is Kevin Ken with Precision Powerlifting Systems. I'm going to do a quick little overview video of kind of like the next series of stuff I'm going to do, which is going to go in line with some of the chapters that I'm doing on the text, like super training, science and practices, and stuff like that. So I think what'll be nice is if we take these general principles and I kind of give the information from those texts about those general principles so that we can kind of really break down the things that are most important in terms of strength training, because that's what we do here. So one of the things that I think, and I'm very guilty of this Jay Birdie's here in the background eating snacks like always. One of the things that I'm very guilty of at times is I can get lost in the world of the theoretical, okay? Because that stuff seems to, when you read about theories, right, and you're reading stuff, you're like, oh yeah, that makes sense, that makes sense, that makes sense. And you can really get caught up in the theoretical because of how good it looks on paper at times. And they're usually very, very intellectual. So you're reading it, it sounds very smart, it makes a lot of sense, but the practical application of them sometimes falls very short. And I've experienced this as an issue multiple times in my coaching career and a few times within the world of powerlifting alone. So one of the things that I like to do is to make sure that I stay grounded as I go back and reread all of those texts. So like super training, science and practices. And I think it's really important to do that to make sure I'm always being pulled back into those general principles and making sure that those general principles are guiding what we are doing. I think we have a sport where there's a lot of inexperience and there's a lot of lifters and coaches that necessarily don't have a lot of formal education in this field. And not that I think formal education is extremely important, but in some cases it is, because formal education forces you to learn the basics and to learn the general principles, and then you learn from there. I do think there's something to be said about experience and everything else too, because you can't just have, all right, well, I read super training, so I know everything there is to know about training. There's something about practically applying it to the real world that's extremely important. That gets missed if you don't have that experience as well. So, I think it's a nice combination of both, right? You need experience and you need formal education. So for me, I have an undergrad degree, I have a master's degree in this field, and I've been coaching for over 15 years, but I've been in powerlifting for 6. So as my experience grows, hopefully my knowledge base grows as well, but it's built off of that formal education that kind of taught me these general principles that I need to stick to at times. But it does get very, very easy, like I was saying before, to get lost in the world of the theoretical because it sounds really good on paper. And this happened to me, I think, mostly with fatigue in general. You read a lot of fatigue research, and there's a lot of variability within that research, and it makes a lot of sense when you start reading it about the psychological components of it, the safety mechanisms that the human body has, and all of those things. So, and then logically you put it into perspective, and it's like, oh, well, I would do the MMA stuff 6 times a week. I would play soccer every day, year round for over a decade. Like, there were just all these other examples that you bring in, and you start using your own perceptions and beliefs and all of that stuff about those topics, and then you start projecting them into what you're doing. And there's nothing wrong with that, because experience should count for something, knowledge base should count for something, and the theoretical should allow us to analyze what we are doing in a critical way so that we can fill in the holes that tend to pop up over time. But what I had lost when I was doing this, I think, was we know that there has to be higher stress days or weeks, medium stress days or weeks, and lower stress days or weeks, right? The high stress days, they're what produce the results, right? And we'll get into this, they're the overload. The medium stress days help to maintain, and the low stress days are for recovery. So we know that those things matter. There's a reason why deloads are pretty universal in powerlifting programs. Now, of course, I do them very differently because I do take some of those theoretical concepts about fatigue, or even some of the progressions we've made in science on stress research, which is down here, and apply it to the way in which I do what we would call our deloads. But there's probably even a bigger picture of things, right? Where what I learned from not paying attention to the general principles of fatigue and just going balls to the walls for a period of time is fatigue accumulates over time, and it happens probably much more slowly than what we think. So maybe what you see is you're able to do it for a few years, but eventually you break, right? So then it becomes filling in those gaps with enough recovery. And maybe there's periods of time we need total recovery. So maybe a complete break from the sport, and just doing different stuff to stay in shape. And I remember Shaco talking about this after a competition, taking 1 to 2 weeks of what he called active recovery. So like swimming and biking or doing some stuff to stay active, but not touching a weight. And there's probably some benefits both psychologically and physiologically to that argument. But I had lost my way in terms of making sure that what we were doing was based on sound principles. And we were just training hard, and not that it didn't work. Of course it did. I deal with a lot of beginners and stuff, so it worked really well until like more people were just complaining of stuff. And then we had to make some changes. And and like I was saying before, there's a reason why people have done it this way for a period of time. And I think it's really important to keep that in mind, that we don't lose our way so much. And I think our job as coaches now are to build off of what they set up for us before, not to completely blow up what they did and start something new. Like I was on the internet where all the good stuff happens. But I see a lot of people like bashing Westside Barbell. It's like Louis Simmons has been lifting since 1960. So he's literally been coaching in this sport for 60 years, which is a very long time. And, maybe some of the reasons and the explanations that he uses for why some of the things that he does works, maybe some of them are outdated and need to be updated. But there's something to it, right? It clearly works. The reason why everybody knows who he is because he figured some shit out, and there were 14 people from his neighborhood that he turned into world record holders. And to me, that's a telltale sign that he knows what he's doing. He's producing good lifters. He's not a coach that just gets somebody who's genetically gifted in the sport and then advertises them on Instagram, and it makes them, by association, somehow a good coach. And this happens a lot now. You got to remember, like with raw powerlifting, it blew up in a very short amount of time. So because you're getting more people in the sport, you're getting more people that just had higher levels of strength when they're starting. So like, let's say I start my coaching career and somebody reaches out to me and like, hey, can you help me? And it's like, yeah, sure. And they're 180 pounds, but the first time they squat, they're squatting 500 pounds. Like most 180 pound lifters aren't even squatting 300 pounds, male or female sometimes. So like for me, I think my resume, I've taken a lot of people from local areas that had little to no experience competing or under a barbell, and we've had very good success. And I've heard people bash the qualifying totals for nationals, but there's a reason it's still the top 10, top 15% in terms of total that qualify for that. And yes, maybe they're not as strong as the ones who are winning, but if they're stronger than 85% of the people doing the sport, the majority, almost half of our team at one point was qualified for nationals. And even under the new stricter guidelines, we have quite a few people that were qualified for nationals. And it's a higher percentage of the overall population of people lifting. And that's just in the USAPL. When you actually stretch that to all federations, they do pretty well in terms of their overall numbers. And these are people who started with very little to no experience. To me, it shows that what we're doing is working. And we focus on these principles. And of course, I've fucked up this over time. But in general, I started working with Shaco in the very beginning of my powerlifting career. And I just kind of mimicked what he was doing. I tried to analyze the lifts myself and come up with the variations and the number of lifts, but I just followed his guidelines. His guidelines were built off of general principles. So we were set up with a very good foundation of what we were doing because it was based on general principles. And even though there are some things that I've adjusted with that philosophy over time, the general principles are still there and they still apply. There's much more in common with Westside and Shaco than what people actually think. And I think it was really important because I think if I didn't have that to start, I would have been lost in that theoretical. Even though I had the formal education that made me learn about these general principles, I do think I would have been lost. And I would have constantly just been trying my own thing without really having a backbone of a structure in which to try these things out on. When we talk about general principles, there's more than what are on this board, but I think these are the ones we could start with and then maybe expand this list over time. So first, I'm not gonna go into huge depth on each one right now. I'm just gonna kind of give a little bit of a background and just kind of explain it, and then I'll go into depth on each one in a video series. So specificity. So the SAID principle, specific adaptation of imposed demand, says that the body will adapt exactly to the stimulus that is applied to it. So the more specific to the actual task or to the sport that we're competing, whatever it is, the more specific it is, the greater the carryover to that skill. So what this says is, let's take a skill like shooting a basketball. Okay, if I decide to go hit a baseball, there's maybe some general athletic skills that do apply, but as an athlete matures, so a real beginner will be able to get skills from doing a wide variety of tasks, right? So they might learn how to shoot a basketball by throwing a baseball. Like there's probably some carryover in the very beginning. But as the athlete matures, there's going to be no carryover whatsoever to shooting a basketball and throwing a baseball. Except maybe throwing a baseball and throwing a football might have some specific carryover to each other because the precision of it, some of the mechanics are similar. The strength necessary might be similar. Hitting a baseball might develop certain reactionary skills that would carry over to playing basketball when you're reacting to a defender or something like that. There are going to be some carryover pieces to it, but at some point, it's too general to be specific enough to carry over into higher levels of skill, but it will help build a foundational base. So if I want to get better at shooting a basketball, I need to shoot a basketball. If I want to get better at throwing a baseball, I need to throw a baseball. General exercises will help to a certain point of view, to a certain extent, but at some point they stop helping and the exercises need to be more specific. And this has literally just made some bells go off in my head about like GPP work and powerlifting. Because there's probably a certain point in which that stuff's important and that stuff can carry over, but there's probably a breaking point where it no longer is effective anymore. And that might be why Shaco and his programs didn't have a lot of bodybuilding stuff. It was very, very minimal. Made up maybe 20% of the overall volume, where something like Westside has a lot more. But that, then comes in the recovery aspects and stuff. And both of their programs, they have these general principles applied. So for the specificity, so I agree with Louis Simmons here that the specificity of the sport of powerlifting is a heavy single. So, with these methods that coaches utilize to apply these general principles, they are going to differ. So for me, a heavy single is specific to the sport of powerlifting because we're looking at force production, right? It's going to be slow velocity due to the constraint of the load applied to the actual load itself, right? So 1 rep max, that's what we're literally doing in the sport of powerlifting. I do not see a set of 10 squats being very specific to the sport of powerlifting. You might have the first couple reps of those sets if they're really driving as hard as they can out of the hole of the squat or off the chest in the bench or whatever it is, or off the floor in the deadlift. Maybe there's a little bit of carryover there because of the force production, but the speed is very different. There's a few issues with that. So somebody like Shaco focuses a lot on the principle of dynamic organization. So the principle of dynamic organization states that the body's always going to look for a more efficient way to move. And you need constant repetition. So the idea is you will never be perfect because the body will always look for a better way to do it, and it'll never stay the same. So if you aim for perfection and you miss a little bit, you're going to be very good, right? If you aim, if you look at technique and you're just like, because biomechanics and physics do matter. So if you look at technique and it's like average at best, then you're not striving for perfection, you're striving for average. And if you strive for average and you miss, you're not going to end up as well off as you would. So biomechanics and physics apply. Principle of dynamic organizations is why he used a lot of variations, because he would use those variations to nudge that efficiency to where he wanted it to go. So he had special exercises in each one of the lifts. So you always had the same foot width, same grips, same deadlift stance. All of that stuff was the same as your comp stance. And these variations would be put in based off of the weaknesses that he analyzed in your lifts. So the specificity of a Shako program is in the movement itself. But then he uses the loads plus the variation. So if I'm doing a pause squat at 75%, it's much harder than a regular squat at 75%. So these variations actually increase the intensity of the exercise. So we're getting closer to that intensity that we would need on a 1RM, but without losing technique. So the principle of dynamic organization, we want as many reps as possible that are going to push us to a more efficient technique. The more efficient technique allows for more motor units to be freed up to push more weight. And these were gradual increases over time that you would see in your squat, bench, and deadlift in your total, overload and progressive overload. Once those numbers are hit, you have new percentages. Your 75% has now changed to 75% of a larger number. So progressive overload was built in. Shaker would talk about load variability being one of the more important aspects of training. This is because of the law of accommodation. So if we do the same thing over and over, it has less of a stimulus, okay? Which can be to our benefit at times because it becomes easier to recover from, but we get less adaptations from it. So you have to constantly change things. So every week with Shako, my number of lifts, my average intensity, that stuff would stay constant, but the variations would change. I very rarely repeated them within a 4-week block of time. But if you stretch that out over to a year, 2 years, 3 years, which I was with him, I repeated these exercises a ton within that 3-year period. And we need to do an exercise over and over and over again to get the benefits of it, but it doesn't necessarily mean we have to do it every single week. You know, if you take a larger viewpoint of the sport itself, you stretch that out over time. I had a lot of experience doing each variation stretched out over a longer period of time. All right, so for somebody like Louis, and I agree with Louis here, the specificity, his main focus is building absolute strength. So that force production underneath maximal weights. And this is where his dynamic effort stuff comes in, right? So force equals mass times acceleration. So what he had said to me on the phone was, if you squat 500 pounds and you just do a single at 500 pounds, you put 500 pounds of force, right? If it's 1 for 1, right? For simple math, we're going to pretend it is, into 1 rep. But if you put, bands on there, 60% bar weight, 25% bands, so you're using 85%, you do a 5x5 there, you're getting 25 reps where you should be putting 500 pounds of force production into it. So if you combine the two of them, you're getting 26 repetitions with 500 pounds of force in a given week. And that makes a lot of sense, right? He's talking about the force production of each repetition being the most important aspect of training. So when you're looking at force as the most important aspect, the specificity becomes the max effort lifts, right? The law of accommodation, so he uses a lot of variation and stuff. Principle of dynamic organization, so on his dynamic effort days, they're doing 25 squats, 25 deadlifts. That's 50 lifts to work on technique, right? So we're getting enough repetitions in there to get more efficient technical movements. There's overload because he uses a pendulum wave scheme, so it increases each week and then it comes back down. Increases each week, comes back down. So you're getting that wave, down, right? Stress management, so these would be like the deloads and the high and low stress days and all of that stuff, and each of them does it a little bit differently. So Shako would have low stress days in there. So oftentimes my day 4 was a very light deadlift technique day, something that would allow me to recover before the following week. And then obviously when they're competing, there's tapers, and they have kind of long tapers, and then a slow increase back into the sport. The biomechanics and physics part, obviously, like I was saying, Louis with the force times equals mass times acceleration. Shako paid more attention to the actual biomechanics of the lift. So we would slow stuff down at times because position over speed was more important to him. Because the weight was going to move so slow underneath a maximal attempt, you didn't necessarily have to move the lighter ones faster to get those results. It was more about get your positions down, better positions make the lift easier to perform, and you can lift more weight that way. Both of them work, but you can see there's a big difference in their interpretation of the general principles into their programs. And it's especially with the speed of the lifts. So because I deal with a lot of beginners, and one thing Shaco was, most of his lifters had over 10 years of experience by the time they came to him because of the Russian system. So because of the experience of my lifters, I think it's more important that they get aggressive with their lighter weights, that force production, because they just don't know how to apply force. And that's something that's learned over time. I think there are times that it's important to slow them down, and if I want them slowed down, I'll just throw in a tempo. I'll throw in a pause. I'll do something that will actually slow them down. And I can control their tempo that way. So if they always come in and it's like, hey guys, 100% effort into each repetition, if they do that, I can then adjust their speeds based off of what I'm seeing and the weaknesses that I see, which is what Shaco did with me. We used a lot of pauses and stuff. And pauses are just this built-in tempo. And I will use tempo lifts and stuff like that as well to build some of those technical capabilities, because every weakness is going to be mental, physical, or technical. Right? If it's technical, sometimes slowing it down is the answer. If it's physical, a lot of times speeding it up is the answer. And then we want that technique to be solid under maximal conditions, right? So applying maximal force. So if we're always slowing it down for perfect technique, we are sacrificing some force production to do so. So there's going to be this balance. Where can I lift more weight and get the most out of it? If I slow down a little bit, my positions are better, and that allows me to lift more weight, that's the right answer. But if I slow down so much to be in better positions that I can't fight through sticking points, or I can't get enough speed to get through a sticking point, then that's a problem. We need to focus more on accelerating that weight. And it's always going to be this balance in analyzing those strengths and weaknesses of each lifter and where we go from there. I did put stress management on here. I was talking about deloads and stuff, and I kind of mentioned some of the fatigue research. And it is making sure that we're keeping that up to date. And a lot of Shaco's lifters didn't have jobs outside of the gym, right? So they did more high frequency stuff. But they may be more capable of getting away with it because of their very large base of experience before they get up there. I don't know for sure, but my guess is as they're coming up through the Russian system, they're not doing high volume, high frequency. I know the GPP stuff is very high in the beginning, and the actual barbell stuff is minimal to not even relevant. And over time, it very gradually shifts. But if you take a lot of people who don't have that 10 years of a foundation built before they do the high frequency, high volume stuff, it's a lot of stimulus. So they might see some great results earlier on, but it's also a lot of stimulus that accumulates over time that might be very difficult to recover from. So what you see here in America is a lot of people who do those higher frequency, higher volume stuff, they don't last as long and they get way more nagging things. Now, this is completely in my experience and the experience of some of the lifters that I've had conversations with that have been around a long period of time. But you do got to remember their bias probably lies more in the West Side style of training than it does in like a Shaco or higher volume, higher frequency type of training. So that's going to weigh into their response as well. But what we're going to do is over time, each week maybe I'll bang out one of these so that we can cover some of these topics in greater detail. And I can kind of give, I think at this point, I've heard a lot of different viewpoints, especially being coached by Shaco, with the West Side stuff so prevalent being around. So I'll cover each one and kind of cover their thoughts on each one as well, so you can see the differences in how it's applied to certain methods and why it's probably really important that each coach has their own methods and their own focus and comes up with their own ideas. Because if you try to blend Shaco with what Louis does, it's going to be very difficult to do because of how they actually view training, right? They follow these general principles, but Shaco views it from a technical aspect of training, where Louis views it more from a specificity standpoint, a strength standpoint of lifting a lot of heavy singles. It's just which of these general principles they view as being most important. But they're all there, and they're just interpreted in different ways. But because they both use these general principles, they're both extremely successful in what they've done. So for now, I'm going to kind of end this here as a quick introductory, And next week we'll start with specificity. So you can follow me on Instagram. It's KWCan, our team, Precision Powerlifting Systems.